Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Glen Weldon. Glen is a writer, cultural critic, and podcaster. Glen currently writes for the NPR Arts Desk, and for over 10 years, he has been a panelist on NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour, a lively roundtable discussion podcast about the latest television, movies, books, games, and comics. And today we will speak about Glen's latest book, NPR's podcast Startup Guide. Create, launch, and grow a podcast on any budget. Glen, thank you so much for helping us become better podcasters.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Alan.
So, Glenn, let's go with your background. In your book, it says that you have been in love with podcasting ever since the idea became something. So, can you tell us, first of all, what was your career before, if you had any, and then how did you discover podcasting, and how do you made it that the center of your life?
Well, my background's in writing. I was a theater critic for a while, a book critic, and I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop back in the late Jurassic, long time ago. And that's how I got into NPR. I started at NPR freelancing by just doing a blog, helping my colleague Linda Holmes do a blog about pop culture. I contributed blog posts every week about comics and other topics. And that led to her and her friend Stephen inviting me to be on a podcast they were starting up with no official, buy-in from NPR itself. Everybody was doing it just on nights and weekends. We would just go into the studio after hours. The guy who was producing the show was also doing it for free. It was basically just something, it was kind of a pilot project, really. But I had been listening to podcasts from the jump. I now listen to over, I think, 400 a week. It's a lot, but I walk the dog a lot, and I do a lot of dishes, and I fold a lot of laundry. But yeah, I love the medium of podcasting. It is different than broadcasting, of course, because it is narrowcasting. It's niche casting. One of the things about podcasts right now, this is changing, but right now it is on demand, which means people who seek out your podcast are seeking it out. It does not come passively to them the way a broadcast, like a magazine show like All Things Considered does, where we try to give all things. We try to consider all the things. If somebody's listening to your podcast, they are interested in your subject, they're interested in you, they're interested in something. And so the connection you have with them is deeper because A, they're inside your head if they're listening on earbuds, and B, this parasocial relationship starts to develop, where what I call unidirectional intimacy. A lot of the podcasts I listen to, I feel like I'm just sitting here listening to my friends talk, and at any moment they're going to turn to me and ask me my opinion. That's the kind of intimacy that's I think unique to podcasting. You feel some kind of affection for a lot of your favorite radio hosts and television shows, but podcasting is different, and that's one of the reasons I love it so much.
And you said that the way that we discover podcasts is changing. How is that changing?
Well, it used to be that people would, just type into a search box, I want a podcast about X. But we are finding increasingly that the younger people are finding podcasts now more passively than just a little bit ago. Now they're finding them through Facebook. They're finding it through their smartphones, their smart speakers. They're finding it through YouTube. YouTube is a big gateway into podcasts in a way it didn't used to be. So, and there's some people who follow a YouTube show, for example, not realizing it's a podcast that also happens to have a video component. So that's changing, but I think this kind of intimacy that develops, I don't think that's going away.
And I have never heard of people finding a podcast on Facebook. How does that happen?
It's just somebody posts something, some snippet of a podcast, and people click through. It's Facebook, so there's always like a lot of hoops to jump through, but they click through and they find it that way. It's not usual now, but it's happening more and more.
So they upload just a snippet or the whole podcast episode?
They just upload a snippet usually, because I think that's the way it goes. What we call audiograms in the business, where you just take a snippet of your show and just have a very static graphic and just maybe a little waveform to show that people are talking. And that actually helps. That's actually one of the ways that I recommend in the book. You get people to kind of follow and find your podcast.
Okay. And so you are busy writing, critiquing, and now doing a podcast. Where the idea of writing a book about podcasting came about?
Well, I love podcasts, and I let everybody at NPR know that. I kept cornering the VP of programming, Anya Grundmann, in the halls, telling her about the latest podcast I was listening to. And they said, you know what, we want to write a book about podcasting. We do a hell of a lot of it. So we kind of want to get our foot in this particular door in terms of how to do it. But my marching orders were not to write a textbook, not to write a resource guide or a dry instruction manual. They want this book to be as, my marching orders were to be as conversational as possible, to make it feel like you are engaging the audience the same way you do on your podcast. So that meant I just went around and I had a lot of conversations with NPR podcasters. Now, not just hosts. I love hosts. You know, I'm a host. I love them. But I wanted to talk to people all along the kind of production pipeline of a podcast, because that's going to be closest to the experience of the DIY podcaster, the person at home who wants to make a podcast. So you need to talk to the producers who do all the heavy lifting in terms of logistics and organizing. You need to talk to the editors who help shape the podcast, turn it into what it is. You talk to the hosts, you talk to the engineers about audio collection and using audio to tell a story. And you also talk to some of the marketing folks about how to get the word out. And also, because I am me, I threw in a bunch of dumb jokes in the footnotes because I am me, after all.
I see in podcasting two parallel channels. One is the indie podcaster like myself who invites someone to have a conversation and hope somebody else listen to it, and the professional podcasting like NPR or the many others. I wonder if you have any comments on the direction of each one of those two parallels.
Sure. Well, I mean, NPR has a lot of resources that we can throw at things, but we don't until we do the kind of, it's research really, but it's the kind of research even a DIY podcaster would need to do. What we do at NPR is ask ourselves a series of questions before we even think about throwing any money or devoting anybody to a potential podcast. And those questions are the same questions that are in the book. You don't have to answer all of them, but knowing they're out there is going to help you focus and make your podcast as clear and consistent as possible. Two of those are two very, very important things. Clarity of purpose, so people know what it's about, and consistency. You're making up contract with your audience. You're telling them, I'm going to deliver this on this day every week, and you can count on it being there. You can organize your schedule around it. That's hugely important. But the questions are about who is the audience. At NPR, we put the audience first, which means when we are preparing to do a podcast, we try to do everything we can to envision our target audience. What do they look like? Not just demographically, but what are their habits? What other podcasts do they listen to? What social media are they on? And if they listen to other podcasts, what is the tone of those podcasts? What's the length of those podcasts? So there's a lot of research that goes into it. And you know, you might not have those resources, but you will have an ability to. There's an exercise very early in the book about envisioning your target audience as thinking of it as a bullseye. So in the center of it are the people you desperately want to reach. These are the people that you want to imagine like you're just sitting in a bar and you're talking to them. And then you have a wider circle, that's people who are kind of connected to those, and then tertiary circle. You're always aiming for the middle of the bullseye. You are always trying to keep your podcast focused on serving those people. But as you grow your podcast, you might be able to reach some of those people on the outer circles as well. And so this book is for you whether or not you want to just launch a podcast and talk to your friends. That's fine. What we can do in the book is help you use a lot of our audio collection techniques and something as simple as mic placement to really make it sound as good as it can. But if you want to grow a podcast and you want to, it may be corner the market, it'd be the premier podcast in your particular field, there's a lot of tools about how to grab an audience and hold on to them, which is very important with podcasts, because a lot of people drop off a podcast episode in the first 30 seconds if it doesn't grab them right away. But having a niche topic is great, because again, even if you don't have a huge number of listeners, Guy Raz says this in the book, he'd rather have 500 people listening to his podcast than 10,000 Twitter followers, because the nature of the connection is so different. The people who are listening to your podcast are motivated, they're driven. People who are following you on Twitter are following you because they happen not to be following whoever else that is that day. You know, your tweet will vanish into the mist. The podcast is going to make a real connection.
Right. Okay. But in a world that there is these several groups producing podcasts and indie podcasters like myself, when I see big industry coming into the podcasting arena, or maybe they have always been there, how do I stay relevant? I mean, how do I compete against the big budgets and engineers and researchers and producers of NPR when I do this, I don't know, part-time and I don't have any sophisticated software or anything of that nature?
Well, you basically try to deliver what you deliver consistently and clearly. I keep coming back to this, but yeah, we have this book was written. The people I got the most from when I talked to at NPR were the interns, because they were doing podcasts, you know, as a side hustle. And so what they do is they find local communities or online communities of fellow podcasters to kind of share and talk. A lot of the people, Yewei Shaw, who is now host of Invisibilia, when she was starting out, she had a group of people, and she would go to them and say, look, I'm great at editing, but I'm lousy at audio collection. Every time I try to, interview somebody, I'm holding the mic wrong or something. And that back and forth, that kind of community is hugely important. Yes, NPR has a lot of money to throw at things, and a lot of like the other podcast networks do. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you as but like the average person who's going to start up a podcast has three very limited resources that they're dealing with: time, money, and passion. And if you got a lot of passion, you can make up for the first two. If you got a lot of time, you can make up for the others. You need all three. But how much you have of each one of those is going to determine maybe what kind of podcast you start off with, right? Maybe you start off with something that's relatively simple, or at least a low lift, and then as things work and evolve, you can grow. My advice is always to start small, because with even some pretty lousy audio equipment, if you do things with mic placement and baffling the sound correctly, you can make it sound okay. A lot of people make the mistake of just investing hugely, and I'd caution them just to take baby steps.
Right. Okay. Well, I don't know the exact statistic, but I'm just guessing this one. About 90% of podcasters, they do it for free, for passion. They don't make any money. On the other side, podcasting has become a huge industry, and there are some players who are making lots of money. Do you have any insights of how big the industry is and where is it going?
It's huge. I don't have numbers at the top of my head, but yes, it's fascinating. And there are a lot of celebrities who've kind of traipsed into the field, and they make it to the top of the iTunes charts. They still have to produce good content. Many don't. And yes, they will. They get a lot of money thrown at them, and they might get a big listenership, but that listenership will drop off if they're just not doing the basics of audio podcasting or even video podcasting that we lay out in the books. I mean, basically, you come into podcasting, you got to ask yourself questions like, not what it's about, right? That's not the first question, but who is it for? That is the key question. Why should people care? How do I reach them? What's the format? And that's going to be guided by your supply of money, time, and passion. Now comes, what is it about? We ask ourselves, before we launch a podcast, okay, so what would we be saying? What would we be offering that someone else is not already offering? And then one of the questions that a lot of DIY podcasters bypass, and ones that frankly at Pop Culture Happy Hour we didn't think about when we should have, is why you? Why are you the one who should be doing this podcast? And maybe it's a different person's perspective, a different person's voice, who should maybe be the host, because you want to, let's take the example of a roundtable podcast. You want to offer a variety of perspectives, people from different backgrounds, people who are coming from it, who are intersecting the culture in different ways, will offer different perspectives. It's not diversity for diversity's sake. It's basically trying to engender a good discussion with different outlooks, and portraying to your audience that not everybody is going to see this thing the same way. At Pop Culture Happy Hour, when we started, we were all friends. And so we were all, middle-aged white people. And that comes with a huge blind spot. And we've made a lot of steps to correct that. And we are continuing to take steps to correct that. And it has made the show objectively better, objectively smarter, and objectively more useful. And that's the idea.
Wow. Could you talk for a minute about best practices of producing a podcast? For example, you spoke about the placement of microphone and maybe having a good soundproof room.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, my personal inclination is that I hear all these podcasts with fancy music and background, and of course I don't have the time or the knowledge to do that.
Sure.
So I wonder how, in the spectrum of sophistication from a simple conversation like ours to, I don't know, all the bells and whistles that an audio engineer could bring to the table, I guess where do people decide where to place themselves? And what are some of the best practices?
All right. Well, I have 5 rules. So NPR's stuff is audience first. Think of the audience. The other thing that it's a big deal for them is to let your audio drive the story. And this is true if it's a narrative, like an investigative podcast, or if it's an interview. You are letting, if it's your narration, if you're an interviewer and you're talking more than the person you were interviewing, if it's your narration that's driving it, you're not getting the most energy from it. You should use the audio as the thing that drives people from one thing to the next. Your narration is the infrastructure that you hang your audio bits on. But here are my 5 rules. Number 1, be authentic. Your audience is going to be able to sense if something's forced, if you're playing on their emotions, if you're calculating an effect instead of demonstrating what you should be demonstrating, which is actual curiosity, actual passion. Again, passion is the thing that sets podcasts apart, as far as I'm concerned, both in the podcaster and the audience. Number 2, prepare. This sounds obvious, but I listen to a hell of a lot of podcasts for an episode or two, where it's clear that they are winging it because they trust that they are brilliant and they can just sit in a room and they'll be funny or they'll be smart. And that tells me that you're not respecting my time as an audience member. I want you to do some prep work. I want you to know the person that you're interviewing, and I want it to sound. It has to sound. It doesn't have to sound. It's great if it sounds spontaneous, but you really need to focus. So as important as it is to prepare, rule 3 is still leave room for discovery. Don't over prepare. Don't overproduce. Invite your audience into your thought process. You want to bring them along. The idea is that they feel like they're sitting in that room with you. So if you have to reach for insights as the podcast is recording, that's great. Find something that you didn't expect to find when you went into the room. That's the goal of every episode of Pop Culture Happy Hour, at least. And then rule number 4 is be yourself, but better. The version of yourself on your podcast it's kind of a performance of yourself. And if that stops you, if you don't like that, don't think of it as a distillation of yourself. There's nothing inauthentic about that. It's just that you are sharper, cleaner, more efficient, maybe funnier. And the way to do that is rule 5, which is, I saved it for last because it's the most important rule. If people ask me, how do I make my podcast better? This is the magic bullet. Edit ruthlessly. Be very, very hard on yourself. This is the secret ingredient. This is the thing that most people skip. But if you want to cut out any digressions, any dead ends, any jokes that don't land, if you want to take the time to cut out ums, ahs, lip smacks. It's not just a service to your listener, to your audience. It is, but it's a way of, you have this amazing tool as you sit there at the editing bay, trying to figure out, you listen to a whole episode through. The editing process is a way of focusing the discussion, of making sure that it's of use to that target audience you imagined back in chapter 1, right? This is a way to ensure that you are delineating what makes your podcast you. And ultimately, this is what the book's about, right? It's not about how to sound like NPR. It's how to sound like you, by focusing on what only you can deliver, which is your story, your passion.
Right. Podcasting is becoming huge. There are more and more people getting involved. There are, I think you mentioned 700,000 podcasts. I assume that's just in the English atmosphere. I don't know if it's globally. But being that there's such a huge demand for podcasting and people wanting to learn about podcasting, you have done a great job bringing us this guy. But are there any, let's say, college courses, community college courses, places where people can immerse themselves in the world of podcasting for 3 months with an instructor and exercises and this and that? Or is that something that people have to learn through online courses?
Oh, I'm sure there are. I haven't checked, but I'm sure there are podcasting courses. I happen to know that NPR runs a student podcast competition every year, and I just listened to the winner of this year's podcast competition, and it's fantastic. And we're coming out with a Life Kit episode, and NPR is next week as we tape this. That's really about how to podcast. And I mean, I said there's a secret. I said editing is all, but in fact, your podcast is going to be slightly different than anybody else's, which means you're going to benefit from one-on-one time, which is, again, why I keep saying go back to those communities of podcasting. Podcasting is unique for many reasons, but one of them is the passion that people who are in it have. And you're going to find if you go to we used to call them message boards. I don't know what we call them now, but like if you go out online and just put some feelers out, you're going to get people who are eager to help you. Once they know, who you are and what you want to do, they can help you develop skills that you don't have. And, because again, you're not going to have a team of people to produce your podcast. You're going to be a one-man band in most cases. You're going to be editor, producer, writer, host, engineer, everything. And so that means that different people are going to come into this with different skill sets. Some people are going to be great on the mic. Other people are going to be much more comfortable cutting tape, as we used to say. And by having a connection, there's a lot in the book about this, about fostering these communities. You can really help make each other better. Yes, courses like are offered in some colleges, and certainly a lot of community colleges now. They're going to help too, because again, you want to get one-on-one time with people who love the same thing you do.
Right. Okay. And the last question then, what are some best practices for promoting a podcast? Let's say someone just listened to this episode, they read your book, and then they say, I want to go and start a podcast. And I have seen people start a podcast, and all of a sudden, a few months later, they have millions of listeners, and they are the ones who never pass the 20 listeners.
Yeah. That's all down to, let me see if I can find the part of the book about the 5 sacred buckets of marketing. I asked the marketing team at NPR who, they say that there's like low lift, high lift, different kinds of methods. Let me see if I can find that. Okay. Your lowest effort is leveraging things you're already doing can provide modest gains, but gains are gains, right? I mean, so if you want to get your donors thanked by name on the show, if you want to use existing services or product, if you want to supply bonus content, these are all potential methods. If you want to offer your listeners extras for which they pay a little bit, these are all ways to get it. If you want to start doing things like ad swaps, again, there's a whole chapter of the books devoted to this. It's and the thing I would reiterate is that engagement is the ultimate goal here. Monetizing is great if it can happen, but I wouldn't count on it. It's a very difficult, shifting, moving target. And the podcast landscape is changing, as you mentioned. It's changing all the time. So I would focus on engagement first, monetization second. That said, there's lots of monetizing ideas in the book.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think you gave us a lot of material to think about. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book. Maybe you could also flash it for the camera.
Sure.
Where people can follow you and see what are you up to.
This is NPR's podcast startup guide, Create, Launch, and Grow a Podcast on Any Budget. It comes out on the 29th of June. And as you can follow me, I'm on Twitter at GH Weldon. I'm on Instagram at GH Weldon. And also you can follow Pop Culture Happy Hour at Pop Culture Happy Hour. Yeah, it'd be great if you could listen. We are now 5 days a week, which is a big deal. And we're very proud of the show.
Glen, thank you so much for your time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Alan.